We've wrapped up week 2. Half the NFL is injured. And if you're watching this, you might be considering throwing in the towel on the 2024 season. While I wouldn't necessarily blame you for that, I would recommend watching the entirety of this video before you go out and start collecting future picks like Infinity Stones. I'll help you figure out if you actually should rebuild and talk about how to do it properly so that you can hit the ground running in 2025. My name is Paul. This is Pure Potential. Let's get into it. The first month of the NFL season is a pivotal time for dynasty managers. And after the relative peace and quiet of the offseason, it can be pretty jarring when the season starts and your players just start dropping like flies. But the last thing that you want to do is rush into a rebuild unnecessarily. There is a ton of randomness in fantasy football, and you want to set yourself up to benefit from that randomness whenever you can. Dynasty managers with stacked teams, they tend to overestimate their odds of winning in a given season, especially early in the year. And on the other side, managers that have more average rosters, they tend to underestimate their odds of winning in a given season. I talked all about this in my first ever Dynasty strategy video way back in May of this year. Definitely recommend checking that out if you want to get a better idea of what your actual odds of winning a Dynasty championship are, and why you need to be careful about how you make these decisions about your dynasty teams. I'll put that link in the description, but the point here is that rebuilding is a costly decision. Quite literally, it literally costs you money to rebuild. You are paying for a season in which your win equity is 0%. And it can be harder than you might think to dig yourself out of that financial hole in future seasons. So what does it actually mean to rebuild? Well, for anybody that isn't familiar with the term, basically what it means to rebuild in dynasty is that you are taking your current team and you are just trying to shift all of the value of that team into future seasons. So you're forfeiting this year and you're going to take all of your productive pieces, all the pieces you have that score points, that are depreciating assets, your veteran players, and you want to turn that into picks and injured players and rookies, anything that's not going to help you now, but could help you later. So that's what rebuilding is. Let's talk about when you should rebuild your dynasty team. But before we do that, you might want to know that I am now offering comprehensive dynasty team breakdowns like the one that you can see on the screen right now. I'll look at your roster and your league mates' rosters to help you determine what is the best path forward for your dynasty team. Every one of my breakdowns is going to come with some high-level goals, which would include a direction for your team. Should you be contending in the immediate term? Should you be rebuilding? And along with that, a to-do list of some immediate actions that you can take, buys and sells, adds and drops, things that you should be doing to help you achieve those goals. And on top of that, additional tips based on your specific league settings and the unique situation that your team is in. So if you're interested in purchasing one of these team breakdowns, you can go down to the description, find the Google form there. You can fill it out, send it to me, and I will get your team breakdown started as soon as possible. Now, if you're not interested in a team breakdown, just go ahead and confirm by hitting the subscribe button. That'll just let me know you're totally not interested. And it's also a good idea because if you're going to be making all of your own decisions about your team, you're going to want to catch all of my dynasty content that's coming out each and every week throughout the season. Okay, so when you're done with all that, I want you to open a new tab and go to keeptradecut.com. We need to find out if you're actually a team that should be rebuilding. And one of the best ways to do that is actually to look at their power rankings tool. So you can input your sleeper league ID. It's going to pull up your league with all the teams in it, and it's going to rank those teams based on the overall roster value. Now, Keep Trade Cut only does this for sleeper and MFL leagues, but Dynasty Daddy has a very similar feature, works extremely well, and it is open to even more platforms like Flea Flicker, Fantrax, and some other ones. But this is a great way to see where you stand within the context of your league. Like if you're already in that top half of total roster value, top half of those power rankings, you really want to be cautious about entering a rebuild prematurely. Remember, it's a very costly decision. You don't want to do it if you don't have to, especially if you have a lot of young star players or you have a good stockpile of future draft picks. You have a pretty safe foundation of value, so you can be a little bit more aggressive in the short term about trying to compete. And if you find yourself in that spot where your team is kind of struggling out the gate, but you go and look at the power rankings and you're like ranked 3rd or 4th, maybe you want to take some of that value and shift that into some slightly more fragile but more competitive pieces. Like you can go out and buy a James Conner, buy an Aaron Jones, go get a Devontae Adams, something like that. A player that is going to help you in the short term. Yes, they're going to depreciate in value. They might even die on your roster. but you know you have this safe foundation of assets. And so you can take on that type of a risk. You can take on that downside. Just remember that the hard part is building that valuable roster in the first place. So if you've already done the whole rebuilding thing and you're just sitting there with 7 future firsts and a bunch of rookies on your team, like you're some dragon hoarding his treasure, just stop doing that. There is no benefit for you sitting out another season. You can only acquire so much buying power. What you need to do now is go out and aggressively start buying point scorers. Go buy some star players and compete this season. But with that all out of the way, let's say you are still set on rebuilding. You've decided that is the best course of action for your team. There are some other factors you're going to want to consider before you move forward. Like, do you have your own first round pick? How is the rookie draft order determined in your league? How active is your league? How many other managers are tanking in your league, or do you suspect will start tanking in your league sooner than later? We've got to talk about all these factors before you can truly decide how you're going to proceed and how you're going to attack this rebuild. So the most important thing is, do you have your own first? Because the biggest benefit to rebuilding is that benefit you get in upgrading your first round pick, ideally getting the 101. In your average rookie class, the difference between the 105 and the 106 and the 101 is massive. Just look at this startup ADP from April and May. You can see Caleb Williams and Marvin Harrison, they're going top 13 overall in startup drafts. And then you have Rome Odunze, he's the 5th rookie off the board, not till the end of the 3rd round. And then the 6th and 7th rookies off the board, Drake May and Brock Bowers, at the end of the 4th round. So if you decided to rebuild last season, you were able to get your pick from, let's say, the 106 up to the 101. That's like gaining 3 rounds of startup value. That's going to be a huge boost to your team. It's going to help you get back on your feet next season. So ideally, before you go into a rebuild, you want to make sure you have your future first. Now, if you've traded it away already, you're probably going to have a hard time getting it back, because the person you traded it to is going to be on to you. They're going to understand why you want it back, and they're going to realize they have a lot of leverage in that situation. But you should still try and see if you can make a deal to get it back. Maybe you can find a compromise between where the pick's valued now and where it's going to be valued if you can successfully pull off this tank, and maybe you can make something work. But even if you don't have your future first, there are just going to be times where you have to kind of eat it and just rebuild anyway. I'm kind of staring down a situation like that in one of my leagues. It just is what it is. Like, if you think you have this good contending team, you trade away your future first, sometimes it doesn't work out like you think, right? Like, if your roster had Christian McCaffrey and Tua and Puka Nacua and Isaiah Pacheco, like, you're kind of just up the creek at this point, and you don't necessarily want to go throwing good money after bad and keep trying to just chase this contending season because, oh, I don't have my first anyway, I might as well just try to win, because you're going to dig yourself into a deeper hole, and then you're going to have to rebuild next season, but it's going to be even harder to build up that value. So even without your first, I think there are times that you need to just go ahead and ship everything off. Just by shifting those productive veterans into rookie picks and ascending young players, you're still going to profit a great deal from one year to the next, and you're going to be in a better spot in 2025. The next thing to consider is how your rookie draft order is determined. So in most of my leagues, the non-playoff teams draft order is set by max points for, which is really just how many points would you score if you set a perfect lineup every week. Sleeper tracks this automatically in the standings, so you can see it very easily. And this, I think, is the most fair way to determine draft order, because it actually tells you the overall quality of the team, and it takes away any incentive to deliberately set a bad lineup to try to lose matchups. So, like, you're not going to have anybody starting Bryce Young over Patrick Mahomes or something like that, because it doesn't matter for their actual standing, because it's all determined by max points. So it's going to count as if they had Mahomes anyway, even if he's not in their lineup. But I know a lot of leagues still use total points or just win-loss record to determine rookie drafts. And honestly, as long as you're still required to set a real lineup, which I think you should always be just for the integrity of the league, it doesn't change the strategy too much. But in those formats, you might not have to be quite as aggressive about getting points off your team, because all the depth on your bench isn't necessarily impacting you every week if they're not in your starting lineup. You also need to consider what the rest of the league is doing, right? How active is your league? If most of the other managers in your league are actually responding to DMs, answering trade offers, first of all, congratulations, because I think you're in the minority. In a lot of my leagues, you really only can get feedback from like half of the other managers, and that can limit your options. But if you do have a very active league, you can be patient when you're shopping your assets, and you can try to get the best possible return, because you know you have multiple trade partners that you can work with. Now, ideally, what you should be hunting for in these trade returns is future firsts. Any future first that you can get, even 2026, even 2027. A lot of people think, well, I'm trying to be competitive next year in 2025. So those future picks, they're not really doing me any good. They're not going to help me compete next year. I think that's the wrong outlook. because first of all, those picks are going to gain value from now until then, no matter what. No matter what happens with those teams, those picks are going to be more valuable next August, next September than they are right now. So you're just gaining value for free if you can buy those picks at a discount, and then you can just flip them on to the next rebuilder next year. But the other thing about these 26 and 27 picks is you're getting them at a discount now. And they often have a better chance of being early than the 2025 picks you can get, because the 2025 picks, the teams that are going to have early picks, they already know that by now. You're probably not going to be able to buy a pick now that turns into a top 3, top 4 pick without actually paying that value. But you can buy a 2026 first that ends up being extremely early, because that team can get totally screwed by injuries, or they can make bad moves in the offseason, or just totally unforeseen things can happen from one year to the next. So I think buying those picks, first round picks, multiple years out, that is kind of a cheat code for rebuilding teams. But if you're in a less active league where you just don't have as many possible trade partners, you might have to compromise a little bit to get deals done. You might have to take a little bit less for players than you really want to. And I just want to say right now that that is okay. You're still going to come out ahead if you're turning these older depreciating assets into future picks. Even if you're just stacking up seconds and thirds, you're still going to come out ahead, especially if that helps you to secure the 101. Because remember, that is the number one prize that you are chasing. And then the last thing you need to consider, and this is also really important, is how many other teams in your league are tanking. If you are the only team that is actively trying to lose games, you're going to get the 101 very easily, because all you really need to do is like empty out one position, like trade all your quarterbacks away or trade all your running backs away, and you will quickly fall way behind the rest of your league, even the bad managers, because the bad managers are still going to be starting players in those spots and getting some points each and every week. So it's really easy to get the 101 if you're the only tanking team. But if you find yourself in a race for the 101, you're going to have to be more proactive about making trades, because number one, this other tanking team, they might beat you to the punch. They might take all the good trade partners. They might get all the best picks and young players that are actually available before you can. And then second, you really need to make sure that you're scoring fewer points than them. So you got to get ahead of that race. You got to get those points off of your team. This actually happened to me last year in a league that uses the standings to determine draft order, because there was another tanking team. We had a head-to-head matchup, and it was basically like whoever loses this game is going to get the 101, because neither of us was going to beat anybody the rest of the year. So that week leading up to the matchup, the trades got kind of insane because we were both trying to just get literally every single point scorer off of our teams. I ended up trading away Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson, who were like my only real players left. And I got back Kyler Murray, Anthony Richardson, and this big package of picks, because those two quarterbacks were both out that week. So I knew I wouldn't have to play them. And anyway, that week I scored a total of 6 points and I lost the matchup. So I ended up getting Caleb Williams because I was able to sell off all of my players. All right, so you've decided to rebuild. You know what you need to look out for in your leagues. What are the next steps? What should you be doing right now? Well, you're going to want to start getting players off your team right away. And you probably want to start with the most valuable players first. So your Tyreek Hill, Kyron Williams, Saquon Barkley, Devontae Adams, those types of players are the ones you want to ship off first, because first of all, they're the biggest injury risks. Like, you have the most value tied up in those players. If one of them goes down, you are now on the hook for a lot of that value. So there's just inherent risk in holding on to them longer than you need them. But also, you don't want to get in a situation where you ship off all the secondary pieces around these guys and then you can't get rid of them because nobody wants to pay up, and you're just kind of stuck holding these depreciating assets, and you're still losing games because you got rid of the other players on your team. And when you're setting out these trade offers, you don't want to go right to the best teams in your league, because first of all, they're not really in a spot where they're going to be desperate to make trades with you. You're probably not going to get the best returns. They're going to be like, yeah, I'll buy this guy, if you're going to give me a discount. But if you go to the teams that are on the playoff bubble, the teams that think that they're one superstar player away from being a real contender, that's where you're going to have some leverage. And also, that's where you might find a first round pick that's available that's maybe a little bit more fragile than the manager thinks it is. So you can potentially pry away their first round pick to give them what they think is the real skeleton key to their big playoff run. But if it's a more fragile team, maybe they get hit with some injuries. Maybe they have a little bit of bad luck. If they don't make the playoffs, you've just made a massive profit on that investment. And then the last thing, and this is super important, don't hoard players. Don't decide that there are like off limits players that you're not going to trade. People do this all the time, and it just drives me crazy because it doesn't make any sense. Like, I'll come across a manager who is clearly rebuilding, and I'll reach out about some totally inconsequential player, like, hey, are you selling Chris Olave? And they'll be like, no, I got to hold Chris Olave. I'm building around him. He's a foundational asset. Don't be that guy. You're just doing yourself a disservice. Like, if somebody is going to give you fair market value for any established veteran player that is scoring points right now, just take it. Seriously, just take it. Because the whole point is that you're gathering as much buying power right now as you possibly can. And then you can just go out next offseason and buy yourself a contender. You don't have to save pieces that you're going to use next year. It doesn't matter if you have Chris Olave. You can go out and get 10 equivalent receivers next year. You're just going to buy whichever one's the cheapest. Literally liquefy all of your assets, or as many assets as you can, and then build it all up from scratch next year. And that's all I got for you. So if you have any other questions about rebuilding, you can leave them down in the comments below. I will absolutely do my best to answer those. If you found this video helpful, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel and consider becoming a YouTube member if you really want to support the channel and you want more Dynasty content from me. The YouTube memberships really help me out. They keep this whole thing going, and you get access to weekly live streams. You get access to my Dynasty rankings that are updated each and every week. So it can be helpful to you. It can be helpful to me. That sounds like a win-win. Anyway, that's going to do it for today, guys. I hope you all win your matchups this week. Unless you're rebuilding, then I hope you lose. Either way, I will see you in the next one.